Alrighty, let's go ahead and get started for this evening, and we'll allow some folks to join us as we go along. So good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Felton. I am with the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, and tonight I am joined by Laura Price. Hey, Laura, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well.
Glad to hear it. Hopefully you're enjoying the nice rain that we're getting today.
Oh, I love it. I'm a rain lover.
You live in the right part of the world, that's for certain.
Yes, I found my way here.
So this evening, our topic is going to be on rainwater management appropriately. So I'm going to, just to go over a couple of housekeeping items as we get started. I'm going to give a brief introduction on the Soil and Water Conservation District. I will then hand it over to Laura for tonight's presentation, and then we'll have a chance for questions at the very end. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little icon that says Q&A. If you have any questions along the way, please feel free to go ahead and hit that button and add your questions, and we'll be able to ask Laura at the very end of the presentation. We're also recording tonight's presentation, and we will be posting it on the SWCD's YouTube channel. And I'll also be sending a follow-up email to everyone who has registered for this presentation tonight. And that follow-up email will include some additional resources that we'll be discussing, as well as a recording of this presentation here. At the very end of the evening, when you exit, a survey will pop up. If you wouldn't mind taking a couple of moments to fill that out, it is a huge help in helping us develop these workshops and webinars as we go along. All right, Laura, you want to switch slides for me?
Yes.
Awesome.
Did I skip one?
One back. There we go. Perfect. So as I mentioned, I work for the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. The Tualatin SWCD is one of 45 soil and water conservation districts in the state of Oregon. Our service area is Washington County, as you can see on the map here. It's just to the west of the Portland metro area. And what our agency does is we're a non-regulatory government agency, and we really work with residents of our community to help protect the natural resources like soil, water, air, you name it, things along those lines. And we do that in 3 different ways. We do that through technical assistance. So we offer advice, provide support. For folks who live in Washington County, we actually have specialists who can come in and walk your properties with you or your community spaces and talk about different ways that we might be able to implement conservation actions. Many of those you're going to hear in great detail about today from Laura. We also offer financial assistance in the form of grants, as well as a cost share program for qualifying projects. And we also help implement these sustainability solutions through education programs. And that's exactly what we're doing this evening. Now, if you don't live in Washington County, I want to encourage you to look to find your own soil and water conservation district, or conservation district as they're also known throughout the country. Just about every county in the US has a conservation district that's associated with it, and many of them provides the similar resources that we do here. So even if you're not in our area, I really want to highly encourage you to look to see what other resources might be out there for you to utilize. Next slide. Now this is our watershed. This is the Tualatin River watershed, the one that Washington County is based out of. Now, a watershed is a bowl or a basin, and you can see that here in this illustration. We have mountains to the west, the north, and the south of us, and that creates this bowl that any water that falls on touches. And what we like to say is that we work on a watershed scale, because we work with any natural resource or any person, property, you name it, any land that water touches. Now, as that water falls on this area, it flows to our streams and our creeks and eventually into our rivers. And it touches each and every one of our areas. So we really like to say that we work watershed wide because we work with any sort of land type that you can find. Here in Washington County, our land breakdown is about 50% forested area, about 35% rural area, and about 15% urban area. But that urban population is huge and growing every day. And really, many of the practices that we can do can have a greater impact within those urbanized spaces. Next slide. Now, how does rainwater management keep watershed healthy? That's why everyone is here today. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time to walk on Laura's toes, but really, rainwater management is all about slowing down water. As rain falls on our urban areas, it can move very quickly, and that can cause a lot of issues like erosion and things along those lines. So if we can slow down this rainwater as it's falling on our urban spaces and allow it to sink into the ground, we have a more healthy watershed because we don't suffer those effects of erosion and things along those lines. So if we can slow water and if we can utilize it in sustainable ways in our urban communities in particular, we are better able to have healthier watersheds. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Laura for tonight's presentation.
Thank you, Andrew. So yes, I guess you can't see me tonight because I had a little goof up with my technical, but the slideshow's here, so that's what matters. So as you know, our title slide says, this is really an introduction to rainwater management, a little bit of a show and tell. All of these practices, or many of these practices that we're introducing, we could go into in a lot more depth, and we will later point you to some of those resources if you want to learn about something in particular with more detail. So I really twofold in terms of when I think about this introduction to rainwater management. First, we're living with increased impacts from climate change. I think everybody notices it by now. And namely, we have more extremes and longer extremes of dry, hot weather. And then our winter rain events have gotten more extreme as well. And so it's very timely to look at how we can modify our gardening practices to better manage and optimize the rainfall that we're getting, which essentially, as I said, we've got 8 months of rain and 4 months of dry. So first, let's look at our, this is a west of the Cascades water cycle here in the Northwest. And we're looking at, typically in our natural wooded settings, less than 1% of rainfall that comes down ends up as surface runoff. And the rest is either taken up by the trees or soaks into the ground. And you can see by this, with this little diagram on the left, they show some percentages that with, vegetated cover, almost 37-38% is taken up by the trees and shrubs and through evapotranspiration, which is returning the moisture to the sky. And then on the ground, it's called an interflow layer, and that's all the needles and leaves and the topsoil, which has a lot of organic matter in it in the forest. And it's like a sponge. It holds up to 25-26% of the rainfall that comes down. And what that does is allow the rain to then soak down into the groundwater recharge area, to the tune of about 36-37%. So you can see, what's running down the surface on the slope is less than 1%. And this is a healthy system particularly for our streams. There isn't that surface runoff is what causes flooding and causes pollution and erosion and all the things that we don't want. And then, of course, we are, in addition to the climate change that we're experiencing, we're in an increasing developed areas are becoming more and more dense in this metropolitan region all the time. And I think it's very telling to look at this aerial photo on the left. I mean, this is I would say a suburban neighborhood, and even has some open space areas and a little park. And yet when you look at it, just where the houses and streets are, it's easily seems to be taking up about 50% impervious surface. So that means 50% of the rainfall right there is runoff that needs to go somewhere. And it's, you know, not just from the streets. It's like in our homes, we have our roofs, our garage, our driveway, patios, walkways that all have been typically impervious. And so when you move into the urban areas, as this one diagram shows, you know, you can have up to, you know, almost 100%, 90% impervious surface. So that is a real challenge, is to manage where that rainwater goes. And of course, with that, rainwater also comes its negative impacts if we're not dealing with it well. Namely, we can see flooding, we can see erosion. There's often a lot of chemical and other pollutants that wash with that rainwater runoff that gets into our soils and streams. And you can see on the bottom to the left, you know, some of the impacts directly to the stream when we have high volumes and velocity of water running through the streams. It's like a fire hose. So it ends up scouring the little creeks and kind of losing that nice gravelly bottom that salmon need for reproducing. And you see a pretty severe bait undercutting in that middle bottom slide. And of course, then what happens is that's a lot of soil that's washed downstream with that erosion. And you start to lose all the nice riparian vegetative cover that keeps the streams cool and provides insect food for the fish. So this is what we're in the big picture really trying to address. And you know, I think the positive message here is what we each do in our own little yard really does have an impact to our watershed, and you can make a difference. So everything we talk about today is really with that purpose in mind. By capturing and using the rainwater in your yard, you can contribute to the overall health of our streams. So let's look at some of the ways to manage rainwater. We're starting simply, like some of the things you can do on a budget or with limited space. So some of it is just working, you know, changing your garden practices. And I would say key to that is that you really want to build a healthy living soil sponge, is what we often call it. And that you get that it's a certain texture of soil. You can see the two photos there, on top, the photo on the left is basically just minerals. And the photo on the right has a very high mix of, you know, compost and organic matter. It's the kind of soil you would probably find in the forest, very humusy, and it tends to be, what shall I say? It's lighter, and it has more pore space for air and water to flow, and that in turn creates a very rich microbial environment, which are key to our, you know, healthy soils and healthy plants. So that's really what we're striving for. It's kind of crumbly, you know, like a cake crumbles or something. So I think that's pretty basic, that you, one of the best things you can do is just be working in a compost amendment with your soil. And it helps it drain better, but it also helps retain moisture longer too. Another thing you can do is really look at the lawn that you have and make some determinations of, like, where is it really useful and where does it not make so much sense. And an easy, well, somewhat easy way to reduce it is by sheet mulching. And that is a practice where we've learned through science that rototilling really does a lot of disruption to the soil profile and the microbes within it. And a better way is to do sheet mulch, where in this picture you see them laying down cardboard over the lawn. And then on top of that, you'd have a very thick layer of wood chips and or leaves, organic matter that would sit and hold it down. Of course, the third ingredient is moisture. And all of that slowly decomposes. The cardboard basically robs the grass from light, and that will decompose underneath, and the chips will decompose on top. And in a matter of, you let that sit for a while, at least, probably 6 months or over a winter is ideal. And you'll see you're essentially building healthy organic soil by doing that. And that now you have larger planting beds that you really can consider putting more shrubs and trees in your yard for that. I just want to add, I just listened to a lecture recently from Washington State. PhD scientist did some research on different mulches, and the conclusion in terms of their effectiveness was to use the basically arborist wood chips. And she also noted that in this sheet mulch method, you really don't, the cardboard is unnecessary, and in some ways is a detriment to the oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange in the soil. So just what's most important is a very thick mulch. Another thing you might look at is if you have any areas of pavement that are not needed or underutilized, and that you can remove. And I've been in several depave projects where we've done it all with people with hand tools, and it can be done. I won't get into the details, but that opens up a lot of area of ground that can also absorb the rain. And this is a very simple practice. Leave the leaves. In fact, SWCD is promoting this. They are, for those of you that haven't heard of them, they are a conservation organization, much like Audubon, although they are here to protect insects and other invertebrates. And they're nationwide, and their headquarters is right here in Portland. And they have a lot of helpful information. So they're a resource that you might check out as well. So their main message is that leaves are not litter. They're really food and shelter for bees and beetles, butterflies, moths, and more, especially through the winter months. A lot of them might be in a cocoon state or a larval state at that point. So it's habitat. But from our perspective, it also helps absorb more rainfall, and it's protecting the soil from compaction just through, you maybe observed this yourself. If you just have bare soil with the rain coming down onto it at the end of the winter, it can look pretty compacted. And so this protects it from that as well. Excuse me. So in this slide, we're looking at a recently completed project on a slightly sloped land. And what we see here is that all of the new planting beds are covered with the bark mulch. That's the dark material that you're looking at. So that's definitely adding to the absorption of the ground, as well as keeping weeds down and keeping it from eroding and compacting, etc. But then, with the more trees and shrubs and ground covers that you plant on that slope, they have deeper root systems that are going to further reduce erosion and absorb the rainfall. And the pathways here are all pervious. It's cedar wood chips, the lighter colored. And again, it's a pathway that is pervious, absorbs and holds the rain. I recommend cedar because it's very rot resistant. I can't emphasize enough, if you have the room, to plant trees. Mature trees provide significant rainwater benefits by absorbing the rainfall and then sending it back up into our atmosphere through evapotranspiration. And I read this fun fact from EPA that a tree with a 20-foot wide canopy can absorb over 1,500 gallons from a single 1-inch rainfall. And I know that the city of Portland has measured cumulatively from kind of their street trees and park trees how much water they absorb over a year, and it's something like 150 million gallons. So, and in addition to that, I mean, it provides shade for energy conservation and extraordinary habitat. So I mentioned a little bit about reducing your lawn, but you might also want to remove it and look at alternatives, or in this case of this eco lawn, you could probably transform your lawn to an eco lawn. And it has the grasses in it, but amongst the grasses you were seeing in this picture, we're seeing some little English daisies. There's also a microclover that is often mixed in with eco lawns, and that's very fine textured and low, and it's great because that is in a legume family, which means it's capturing nitrogen from the air and replenishing nitrogen to the soil, which is a great feature of all the plants that are in the legume family. You also might be interested in converting some of the lawn into or other bare areas that you have, or fields, into a meadowscape. And you can see the down here reference West Multnomah has published a handbook on creating meadowscapes that you can avail yourself to if you're interested in that. And of course, both of these are tremendous pollinator habitat. And when the main reason we encourage removing and or at least limiting areas of lawn is it's a high input thing, in that it needs it typically needs a lot of water. It needs, you look at the regimes that people do with their lawns with chemical pesticides and fertilizers, and then mowing with the gas mower, which also is not really great. And it has very, it's very shallow rooted, so it doesn't actually absorb as well rainfall as well as, planted areas and larger plants. And so it has very little ecological value. So many reasons to take a more scrutinizing look at your lawns. We like to suggest, if you don't have a big yard or mini yard, even have it planting a little container garden, how in addition to your own enjoyment of that, they're doing their bit of absorbing the rain, but they're also attracting pollinators and adding beauty to your balcony, patio, or front entry. And again, a lot of these that we're looking at are probably on the drought tolerant side and have some nice pollinator value. So around the home, this is even getting away from the garden, but all of the things that you can do to reduce pollution in your living, practices that you can incorporate or add on to your living patterns is, maybe everyone does this, but simply washing your car at a car wash is limits the amount of detergents and such that are going into our storm drains, and that is recycled water, so it's more efficient that way. There are a lot of alternatives to cleaning products that you can use that reduce pollution into our wastewater. Of course, the obvious, which should be done anyway, is pick up and dispose of pest waste. And look, it's really a learning process, but there are ways to control pests and weeds without chemicals. And two of the best resources for this that gets into all kinds of alternative methods is OregonMetro.gov, their waste management program, and they have a natural gardening program as a part of that. And also OSU Extension is just a plethora of good information for gardeners. So now we're going to kind of, we're introducing you to several practices that can be added to or incorporated into your garden. And again, with these hotter, longer summers, I think there's more interest in rainwater harvesting. And as you can see by this cover photo here, because of our climate being 8 months of raining and 4 months of dry, for harvesting to be useful, it has to be a pretty large cistern. And here's a before and after example here. So think big. I believe you're looking at about a 5,000 gallon tank right there. And you can see where the original downspout was in the beginning. And of course, it's going right down into the ground, connected to a city system, that will then go into the street and to the wastewater treatment plant, even though it's just, rainwater. So that's a lot of what should I say? It's unnecessary processing of water coming through the treatment plant that can be handled other ways. So this is a fun fact. So each square foot of your roof collects a half gallon of water per 1 inch rainfall. So in other words, if you had a house that was 15,000 square or 1,500 square feet, excuse me, that collects almost 1,000 gallons each 1 inch rainfall. So that, and how many inches do we get a year? About 35, 40 inches. So, you multiply that. That's a lot of rain that if it could be captured would be a pretty substantial contribution to watering our gardens. We're not promoting this as potable water, but if you I've read through my water bill basically, and other sources that it's almost 70% of our total bill, depending, I guess, how much of a gardener you are, can be used up for summer watering outside. So having rain harvesting cistern or barrels could result in significant savings for you on your water bill, especially over time. It might pay for itself. If you don't have the space or desire to have such a large cistern, of course, there are ways to bury them as well. You might consider using a modular system to harvest the volume of rainwater that you desire. I guess the advantage of this is it doesn't need to take up as much space. You can see how they're stacked differently in a couple of these photos. And as much as you can use gravity flow, it makes it a very simple system if you can do that. And I like the example on the right, very simple DIY, but you can see through that stacked system how when the water collects and fills up one barrel, it overflows into the next and then into the next. And then the little spigot is at the bottom. So back to these larger cisterns. And actually at some point when the barrels or cistern fills up, it will overflow unless you disconnect it before that point. And then you still want a way to convey that water away from the house. So in both these examples, what you're looking at is a rain garden in the front of the photo, or bottom of the photo, I should say, in front of the rain cistern. So that's a perfect way to continue to capture the water from the downspouts, filling the cistern first and then capturing it or sending it into the rain garden to get it to replenish the groundwater. So speaking of rain gardens, let's look at a few and talk about this a bit. This is one right here. You can see, what do you notice? First of all, it's kind of a sunken area that, and they're always located so that water can flow to them. And basically it's fill up like a puddle, and it's held there so that it's slowed down and it seeps in over time. Here's a diagram. So you can see it's basically a sunken garden bed. It's, in this case, it's collecting rainwater from the rooftop, but you may have opportunities to, send it from a driveway or sidewalk, parking lots and streets, in our commercial and public areas also can take water off of them and steer them into a rain garden, but we're mostly talking about residential. So the elements that you see in this diagram is the roof water coming in from a downspout, and that the depth, it may only be, here it's 6 inches, it could be up to a foot, but by the by, they're very shallow. It's not a deep, hole or anything. And in this cross section, we see some aligning of amended, that's your composted soil, and that's primarily just to establish the plants in the rain garden. And because they're serving a purpose there as well. So the water is both draining down and replenishing the groundwater and being taken up by the plants. And hopefully your rain garden is sized that it can always, depending on what size of storm you have, it's large enough to basically accommodate the rainfall coming into it. But again, we always included a design for a little overflow, like where would that water go safely if it did overflow in a super big event. So as that water soaks into the ground, and it usually just takes about a day or 24 hours, the soils, the microbes in the soil and the plants are also serving a water quality function in that they break down a lot of the everyday pollutants that we produce. Maybe not you, maybe not me, but we have a lot of pollutants. I like this slide just to show you different characters and examples of rain gardens. So you can really design them to suit your taste. I mean, there's rain gardens in the sun, rain gardens in the shade that would use a whole different palette of plants. You also can see some are really dense and others are more sparse because they want to feature that lake look. And some are, in this case, very pronounced as a feature. Or you could have a rain garden that's so discreet, it blends in with the surrounding landscape and people wouldn't even recognize it as such, but it's there doing a very important function. So, to build a rain garden, always with like so many things, there's some important upfront planning and site assessment that would be done before you actually start digging in the ground. Things to consider are how permeable is the soil, how steep is the slope, how much water is coming through each downspout. And that there will inform you as to how large a size you want to make the rain garden to accommodate that. And then you want to choose the best location for it that, you don't want too much distance between your downspout and rain garden, but you also want some setbacks. Namely, you want to have it, at least 10 feet away from the foundation of your house if you have a basement. Retaining walls, property lines, tree canopies are all places that you probably want to avoid or consider, in deciding the best placement. And I just want to mention, which I think Andrew already did, is if you're interested in learning about this in detail, the whole nitty gritty nuts and bolts, we say, East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District offers a host of workshops. 3 of them are on building a rain garden this fall, one in October, one in November, and one in December. So check that out if you want to learn about this in more detail. So assuming you figured all of that out, you're ready to build, and really the steps of that are, again, test that soil permeability to where you, once you determine a location, to make sure that it drains sufficiently. And then excavating, and you can see in the middle slide, they've got the size determined, and they have the bottom and side slopes of the rain garden essentially graded. And then adding compost for those plants that you're going to put in, and then determining that connection to the downspout. It can be either an underground with a connection with it's called an ABS pipe that's usually 3 or 4 inches in diameter, or you can design an overland swale, which has the look of a little dry, river creek with rocks, and that can convey the water from your downspout to the rain garden, assuming that you have that 10-foot setback that is not pervious. And then planting. I like to show this just to give you a look at one that's freshly installed, and probably in this case a pipe is coming underground to the garden right at this point, the rain garden. And this is it after a couple of years, fully established. This is as you can see, in the front yard. I think it still has a lot of street appeal, and the casual passerby won't even know that that's a rain garden, but it is, and it's doing a very important job. If you don't have enough room, or maybe one of your downspouts is just emptying out on your driveway, you could consider doing a rain garden planter for small spaces. So it's providing much of the same benefits, maybe not at quite the same scale or level as an in-ground one, but it still is helpful. And the key difference here, if you can see my cursor, is that this pipe installed is, for overflow. So once the planter fills up at this level, it's going to go down, and it will come out somewhere. And so it's maybe not capturing all of the water, but it's still, the rainfall is absorbing into that soil, and the plants are taking it up, and it's providing, again, that water quality, improvement. So it's still a useful thing. So next, we're going to talk about bile swells. You see one right here that I imagine is coming from a downspout. And a lot of folks, wonder what the difference is, which is understandable because they're very similar in a lot of ways, but in their function. But bile swells are generally a linear system, and often on sloped ground that's receiving water and conveying it somewhere, or diverting it somewhere that is, away from where it might be a problem. And as you can see in this photo on the right, in the diagram in the center, they're typically vegetated channels. And if you have slope, they often contain a rock or log check dam. And the purpose of those is, again, to slow, if there's a slope, that means that water is flowing. So you want to slow the flow, and that increases the water or the rainfall in terms of infiltration into the ground, and which also then filters the pollutants. This was the little photo on the left was just one of my walks I noticed, and they've really taken their downspout and created almost like a dry little riverbed to let that water meander through the yard and sink in. And the planting that you see is a whole yard instead of lawn. That is a woolly thyme, which is very drought tolerant. And yet it's kind of giving the same sort of mono, peaceful green that a lawn provides. So here are some of the uses of bile swells in the home setting that one might consider using. So on the far right, we see a bile swell between the house and the fence, and the backyard is, where is that back? That might be front yard and it's being sent to the backyard, but it's going down slope. And there's also a slope down from the foundation. So it's taking that water and conveying it, from uphill to downhill and away from the foundation. And you can see in this photo, there's, there is some slope there. So they're using, these are the check dams I mentioned of little stacked rocks that slow that water in between each check dam. And these are often rushes or sedges that are used at the bottom of the rain garden because those are our native wetland plants that are used to being, having their roots soaked and being inundated for a period of time. So a common use of a bile swell, which I already mentioned, oops, jumpy fingers, let's get back, is a way to connect your downspout to the rain garden. So the caveat on this, because you can see this one, which is pretty close to the house or the foundation, of course, we don't know if there's a basement there, is that you would have a liner under that rocky swell for the first 6 to 10 feet. And then beyond that, the water can sink in, is the way you would do that. The upper left is, this was a project I worked on with a fellow designer. And this yard has other yards around it are higher, and there's a lot of kind of underground seeps in this particular neighborhood. And the lawn was always squishy and wet. So in this case, we installed, you can see this sort of rock swale border between the planting bed and the lawn. And in this case, we've actually added beneath those rocks a French drain. So it's capturing all the water seeping in and conveying it around the lawn to, in this little upper left corner is a rain garden. So it's conveying it to that spot where it can sink in an effort to make this a more usable lawn. Down below, we're looking at a median strip between street and parking lot. And, given the, if your house is situated where there's kind of a slope down a sidewalk, it doesn't mean it's not even a large slope, but you can imagine that water is running for quite a length here. So if you can provide a swale or rain garden in that median for it can kind of jump off and sink in these median areas, that's a really great thing to do. Technically, it's not your property, it's part of the right of way, but planting is certainly, something you can do and kind of extend your garden. And in this case, it's, also capturing some rainwater. In the center bottom slide, we see a driveway that, again, they typically slope down to the street. So there's a lot of water flowing down. Hopefully they all have cross pitches as well. And in this case, we see they've created 2 points where that water can flow in and gather, rather than just running straight to the street. And one more example of how you might use a bile swell, and this would be, I imagine this being used on, say, a larger, hillside slope or larger properties. And essentially what they're doing is cutting a swell along the contour. So that's perpendicular to the way the water would want to flow. On steeper properties, this is, you can have that runoff really gathering speed and causing erosion. You'll see little rills they almost create their own streams. The rainfall will, if you don't have a way to sink it into the ground. And so we can see in this little underground diagram how that works. It's, rather than just flowing straight downhill, it fills these little swells, and then that slowly sinks into the underground. So you have a kind of a plume of more moist soil. And I worked on a project with Native Americans that were on their hillside. They were establishing salmonberry and huckleberry and all kinds of native berries, and they did have a pretty severe, runoff because it was situated on the backside of Kelly Butte. So this was a great way to plant and establish all these shrubs along, basically on the mound or in this area right, below each swell. So now we're moving on to paths and walkways and driveways, and basically the message is as much as possible, keep them pervious or make them pervious. Again, we're just showing you examples of how to accomplish that. These are all kind of hard pervious paths, meaning they're used with rock and stepping stones. So like here on the left, and they have a little gravel in between. So there's still plenty of places even on the, this is a narrow walkway anyway, but yet, everything is encouraging the water to get into the ground. And this middle slide is a pea gravel, which feels nice to walk on. It's a little looser. And of course, these all need edging to hold them in place. And you wouldn't want to use pea gravel on a sloped path so much. You might instead consider in the upper right, this is a quarter minus gravel, which means it's gravel. It's all angular, and it's gravels that range from the size of a quarter inch down to basically, fines of ground rock. And so what happens with that is, because it's angular, it can compact together very easily, and it gives you a pretty compacted walkway. This too is being held in with an edge, so these are a little more formal, but you can go very informal with your stone. In this case, it's recycled concrete. So, something to think about if you actually have some pavement you want to remove, you can, rather than hauling it off and putting in the landfill, which worldwide is the largest amount of waste that goes into our landfill. You can make a flagstone walkway at with very little cost as an alternative to using real stone. And these are various paths that are all used more with organic material. So I just wanted to throw in, you may not have a reason or need for lawn, but just considering as a pathway itself is kind of a fun idea. English gardens use that concept a lot. In this case, it's going through a somewhat woodland garden. But, we have ample sources of bark chips, and they are a fine material to use for our paths, especially through, at the top, it's a vegetable garden, and down below a much more wooded, natural looking garden. So perfect path surface for that. Or you might just place stepper stones within a ground cover that you see here. So it gives you a, a place to walk, but again, it's very soft and absorbent for the rainfall. So, next to our roofs, the driveway is probably the big, largest area of impervious surface. And so, they don't need to be impervious though, especially I feel like we've had permeable, pervious pavers for quite a number of years now, at least, 12 or 15. And basically their design is such that they have these spaces where the rainfall can go through. And if you look at this cross section over on the left side, the distinction is that they have a pretty deep gravel base underneath, for which basically captures that water. It will infiltrate through the gravel base, almost like a what am I thinking? A dry well, and if you're familiar with that, and then sinks down there into the subgrade or the ground and recharges the groundwater. A few more pervious driveways. On the left, it's a grass block paver driveway with grass growing in all the spaces. I know one of the brand names is Grass Creek, but there's others as well. And with that growing over time, it actually could just look like lawn, but have the support and loading ability of a driveway, and great for sort of overflow areas as well. If you feel like you need that loading support for a vehicle. And on the right is pervious concrete. It looks, some years back, we used to have concrete sidewalks with an aggregate finish, and this looks kind of like that. Really, it's this way all the way through. I would compare it to a rice cake. So it has lots of spaces in that mix where the water can flow on through. So there's really no reason we have to have solid concrete or asphalt pavement or bricks anywhere. It's too easy to provide pathways and driveways where the water can still sink into the ground. And one more example, these are referred to as Hollywood driveways, where you're just sort of limiting the amount of pavement you have to just where it's used, like the tire tracks. And in the center is a place for the water to run off to, and you can almost see a cross pitch to those two concrete tire paths, so that water flows, toward the center. So we're seeing lawn in one area, and the center is actually a combination of various succulents and thymes, but really any kind of low ground cover could work in this method. And another example of pervious pavers being used for the walkway here. So really, kind of in summary, I want to bring you back to the big picture, and that is that, rainfall is a resource and for us, and by capturing that rain and getting it in the ground, we're really mitigating all of the negative impacts of rainfall, and at the same time positive impacts by getting more rainfall into the ground. So and it's also improving our water quality. So not only do you get a more beautiful garden that can conserve the amount of municipal water that you use, it's really contributing to our bigger region and our streams and our salmon habitat. So these are just some of the dates coming up that you can also learn about both these rainwater harvesting and rain gardens 101 in a more detailed fashion. And I think from there we'll take questions. So yeah,
absolutely.
we're close, but we can get a few.
Absolutely. No, we absolutely can get a few. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. We haven't received any questions yet, Laura, but I did get one from the registration that I figured I'd read out while folks are
Good
gathering
idea.
some of the
Yeah.
questions. So this question is, what is the lowest evergreen ground cover that they can plant in a swale area that is west facing and in zone 8?
Oh my.
It's very
I love the
specific.
specificity of
I
that.
know it's very, very specific, but I feel like when we're talking about ground covers, especially, it's great to start talking about some specific species that folks can be on the lookout for. So I figured it might be a good conversation.
Okay, so just remembering everything of that, it said was west facing, was it sunny?
It doesn't say if it's sunny, it says it's west facing and zone 8.
Well, if it is sunny, and I'm thinking west, when I think west facing, I think of sun, but you know, the native strawberry, Fragaria chiloensis, is a real fast cover to the ground. And it's about, you know, maybe 3-4 inches high, and it gets pretty flowers and it gets little red berries and it's evergreen. So that's one on the top of my head that I would suggest. But you know, the caution to that is it all depends on how big and deep the swell is. Generally speaking, at the very bottom, that is could be holding water. We look to our wetland plants, as I mentioned earlier, our sedges and rushes, and they are all you know, 1 to 2 feet tall.
Yeah, not too bad. So yeah, so if it's low in the swale, sedges or rushes, or if it's up high, strawberry is probably a good one to look into. I like it. Sounds great.
Yeah.
So we just got a question that came in. So do you have any recommendations for succulents or specific plants that do well in a Hollywood driveway?
There I am, I'm back. Well, we do have 2 native succulents that you can look up. I'm just being a little, I don't have them at the tip of my tongue right now. But honestly, I think, you know, there's such a variety of succulents that are available, and they would all kind of behave the same way. I mean, when I've gone to the nurseries, you can create quite a mosaic with different textures and colors, and I wouldn't hesitate to kind of blend those in with our 2 native succulents that we have most common here on the west side. Obviously, there's more on the east side where it's drier. But.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember their names. I know they're both,
Or
I believe they're stone crops,
organum
right?
and spathiphyllum. One is more of a blue-gray green, and one is a real, you know, solid green. And they tend to have kind of yellowish little flowers when they do bloom.
Yeah, Oregon stone crop is one, and then broadleaf stone crop, I believe, is the other.
Yeah, that's a common name. I tend to forget common names and
I'm in a bad habit of remembering common names, and they
well,
lead me
the
astray
common names
often.
are all over the place. You know, it's just sort of like the nickname, and it can cause a lot of confusion. So in
Very
my
true. Leads you
profession,
astray sometimes.
we learn the botanic names, and it actually can be quite fun because the Latin words tell you something. Like dentata means it's got a tooth, you know, zigzaggy edge, and you know, and something else means it's fuzzy, and you know, it's really kind of fun.
Absolutely. Great. So we got a few more questions in. So will permeable pavement work on a slope?
Well, yes, it will. I mean, the caveat again is like, well, how steep a slope are you talking about? I mean, if I'm looking at, I've just been cutting in, I have a big slope on my property that's like 22 to 25%, which is not comfortable to walk up. So what I've done is I've actually kind of like one would do in our forests, you know, cut a slope, kind of cross slope, zigzagging. I call it my little Lombard path, street path. So that it's generally speaking in building paths, it's, I would say 12% is about as steep as you want to go. And that, I'm looking at what I have, 10, 12%, and it seems gradual enough to be comfortable to walk on and also to hold like say a quarter minus pavement that I would put in there. And certainly with steeper slopes, you could just go, wood chips would, they get wet and they kind of hold in place because of that, especially if it's a, not, you don't want to go for the big chunks, but more of a finer.
That makes sense.
Mulch, yeah.
So another question we got was, what are some good native plants for a shady rain garden?
Okay. So once again, I want to stress that at the very bottom of the garden, the part that will be underwater, you want to stick with there's different species of rushes and sedges, but you could also, our native camas is used to growing in kind of wet meadows and emergent wetland areas. So you could put some of that in, and actually they're big. So you may not have room for it, but both are, our red twig dogwood or willow would get really big, but red twig dogwood would be 1 or 9 bark, are shrubs that could do all right in the bottom, but certainly in the shade, once you get to the slopes and you're still under the shade, I would be looking at all of the plants that you would see in our shady or habitats: sword fern, salal, evergreen huckleberry, and there's a ton of ground covers, whether it be the oxalis or wild ginger, are a couple of ground covers. There's piggyback, there's fringe cup. These are all sort of herbaceous perennials that you could put on the side slopes of that shady rain garden.
Nice. Just got a follow-up question about rain gardens. So I'm gonna skip that one ahead. So do rushes and sedges for the wet part of rain gardens die back, or do they need supplemental watering to survive Oregon's summer droughts?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Well, as what we say about all our natives and why we value them is, they were here before we were, and they're used to this distinctive climate that we have that is 8 months wet, 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 especially in the wetlands, where they're underwater, but they also have to make it through our dry summers. So they, for the most part, I would say, yes, you don't need to water them, but also that being said is, what was I going to say about that? You want to make sure they, in the beginning, when you really want to establish those deeper roots, for the first season or maybe 2, you do want to provide some supplemental water through the summer to keep them healthy. And then once they're established enough, they'll probably have those, and have those deeper root systems, then they can generally take it through the summers. But, last summer was intense. So
I was about to say,
that,
yeah.
I really, it's like, get to know your plants and know when they seem to be kind of struggling for, could use some moisture. And when you do water, this is really important. Any of the, it's like having a sprinkler over it or even hosing is not as valuable as, say, a drip system, or you want to water less often, but water more deeply is the main rule of thumb here, so that it gets down deep enough to promote those deeper roots. You'd be surprised when you're standing there with a hose and watering, and then you scratch the surface. It's like, oh my gosh, it's still dry, a half inch below the surface. So, that's important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So another question. So this person has a very small yard that's about 11 feet wide. So they don't have a lot of clearance for a bile swell or rain garden. But their back of their yard is up against a pretty steep slope, so they do get some soil erosion. Do you have any advice?
So, do you have a fence on your yard, or is it on that backyard, or is it just a sloped area? In that case, if it's too steep a slope that's kind of eroding and sloughing down to the toe of the slope, I might even think of kind of building a little low retaining wall, maybe a foot high. It ends up being kind of a nice seating wall as well. And it reduces the steepness of the slope in doing that. So you don't get that sloughing off the slope. And by reducing that steepness with just adding a little retaining wall at the bottom, it makes it a little easier to establish plants on that slope as well, if it's not too steep. So I don't know if that applies to your situation exactly, but it is a solution.
Yeah, no, that's a tough situation to
Yeah.
try to tackle. But I do like your idea of doing that small retaining wall. That does seem to at least hold some of that slope back, and then you can kind of build up and get some deep rooted plants from there.
Or another way you could, more informal than a retaining wall would be kind of some strategic placement of boulders. And especially if they help kind of create more pockets to establish plants, anything, so you just don't have that water draining straight down the slope is another way to go as well.
Great. So another question came in, and I can take this one, but I'd love to get your thoughts too, Laura. You might know a little bit more than I do. So the question is, are there any financial incentives for sewer and water districts to disconnect downspouts and redirect rainwater? They live in Portland. So I know within Washington County there is not, but I do believe there are some financial incentives in Portland that you might know a little bit more about than I would.
Yeah, it all started with a downspout disconnect program, especially back in the day when, I don't know any of you, if many of you have been in Portland for a decade or two, but, with the stormwater, I'm using that right now because that's how the Public Works refers to it. It's a combined pipe that conveys sewer and stormwater. So when we had big rain events, there was actually several times that water, they couldn't handle it all. And we actually had it overflowing into the Willamette River, which meant sewer combined with the rainwater. So, that's why there's all these incentives to disconnect in Portland, to at least on the east side, to disconnect the downspout and send that water, somewhere in your yard where it can safely sink into the ground. And I'm pretty sure that incentive is still there. BES, Bureau of Environmental Services, would be the agency to get more information about that. And what they end up doing, given how much you disconnect, they remove that a portion of yours, the stormwater portion of the bill. And so you see reductions. I know Gresham does that as well, but as you say, more about Washington County.
Yeah, I know Washington County does not have that because the sewer systems in Washington County are, they're not a combined system, they are separate. So that issue doesn't pop up quite as much within the water treatment
That makes
landscape.
sense.
But I do know within Portland, depending on where you are, there might be potential ones to look in, and BS is a good organization to contact about that.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, that is the last question that we have tonight. Let me just double check the chat. Okay, we're looking okay. So that's the last question for this evening. So I want to thank you again, Laura. I know this is the first time for us running through this presentation, and it was great to see it come to fruition. So, and thank you all for joining us. As I mentioned, I will be sending out a follow-up email that will contain a lot of the resources that we spoke with tonight. And if you do have any follow-up questions for myself or for Laura, please feel free just to respond to that email, and we can help you implement some solutions. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.